For years, one of America's biggest strategic advantages was never just its firepower. It was the assumption that when a crisis got truly dangerous, its allies would eventually line up behind it. That assumption is now being tested in the Gulf. President Trump has publicly demanded help reopening the Strait of Hormuz after the war with Iran pushed one of the world's most important energy choke points into chaos. But instead of a united Western response, what has emerged is hesitation, distancing, and visible strain. That is why this story matters so much. It is not only about ships, oil, or even Iran. It is about whether the United States is discovering, in real time, that in the most dangerous phase of this crisis, it may have to carry the burden mostly by itself. The headline version is simple. Trump wanted Allied warships in and around Hormuz, and key partners did not rush to sign on. Reuters reported that Trump warned NATO of a very bad future if allies did not help open the Strait of Hormuz, and also pressed China to help because of its heavy energy dependence on the route. The Financial Times then reported that major NATO powers, including the UK, France, and Germany, rejected the call for a US-led Hormuz armada. They stressed that they did not want to be dragged deeper into a wider war with Iran. That is not a formal breakup of NATO, but it is a sharp sign that America's coalition reflex is no longer automatic in a Gulf war it chose to escalate, and the stakes are massive. The Associated Press reported that the Strait of Hormuz carries about 1/5 of global oil shipments, making it one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth. When the route is threatened, it is not just a regional problem. It becomes an economic shockwave that hits fuel prices, shipping costs, insurance rates, airline routes, and political stability well beyond the Middle East. That is why even a limited conflict around Hormuz can become a global crisis in days, and that is why the lack of Allied enthusiasm is so consequential. The mission Trump is asking others to join is not symbolic. It is dangerous, expensive, and potentially open-ended. What makes the current moment more striking is that the U.S. is not asking for help in a vacuum. CENTCOM says U.S. forces launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th and have continued conducting strikes on Iranian command and control facilities, air defenses, missile and drone launch sites, and military airfields. Official imagery and releases also show major U.S. naval and air assets flowing into the region in early March. This includes the USS Gerald R. Ford transiting the Suez Canal on March 5th as part of the expanding posture. In other words, Washington is not seeking support before entering the fight. It is seeking support after already becoming the central military actor in it. That difference matters enormously to allies deciding whether this is collective security or an American-led war they do not want to own. That helps explain why Europe's answer has been so cautious. The Financial Times reported that Britain, France, and Germany all declined to join a US-led naval effort to reopen Hormuz. Leaders emphasized that NATO is a defensive alliance and that they did not want to be drawn into a broader Middle East war. Germany's position was especially blunt. An AP dispatch reported that German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul said Berlin would not become an active part of the conflict. He argued that lasting security for Hormuz would come only through a negotiated solution. That is not just tactical hesitation. It is a different diagnosis of the entire crisis. Washington is still leaning on coercive leverage. Key European allies are signaling that military escorting without political settlement could make the situation worse. And once Germany takes that line, the pressure grows on the rest of Europe to resist mission creep. Reuters had already reported in late February that Britain relocated some diplomatic staff inside Israel because of rising regional tensions. Commercial actors like Maersk rerouted some sailings around Africa due to Red Sea constraints. Those moves showed that even before this latest Hormuz showdown, governments and businesses were already treating the region as unstable and escalating. So when Trump asked allies for more military participation, European leaders were not starting from a place of calm confidence. They were starting from a place of visible regional spillover, high risk, and uncertainty about where the war might go next. That broader instability is one reason this may not become the kind of coalition Washington expected. The AP reported that naval experts see reopening Hormuz during active conflict as extraordinarily dangerous. This is because Iran still has anti-ship missiles, drones, fast attack boats, and naval mines that can threaten even advanced navies. That means any coalition mission would not look like a simple escort job. It would look like a sustained, contested military operation inside one of the world's most militarized waterways. And that reality changes the political calculation for every capital. It is one thing to endorse freedom of navigation in theory. It is another to send ships into a corridor where a single missile strike, mine hit, or drone swarm could kill sailors and instantly turn a limited mission into a national trauma. That is also why the phrase, "America alone," needs to be understood carefully. The United States will not literally be alone. It still has bases, access arrangements, intelligence links, and varying degrees of quiet support from partners across the region. But the question is whether it will be alone in the most politically visible sense, alone in putting its own navy, its own air power, and its own prestige on the line to break Iran's grip on Hormuz while its major treaty allies stand back? On that question, the answer increasingly looks like yes, or at least mostly yes. AP reported that Trump later insisted the U.S. could break Iran's grip on the strait without allies' help, even as key EU states and France remained reluctant. That statement sounded defiant. It also sounded like an admission that the coalition he wanted did not materialize. And that is where the NATO angle becomes politically explosive. If America expected Allied reinforcement and instead got lectures about diplomacy, limited mandates, or defensive posture, the real damage may not be operational first. It may be psychological. Trump's warning that NATO could face a very bad future if allies refused to help was not just a negotiating line. It was a glimpse of how this crisis could reshape alliance politics themselves. For years, the core Western bargain was clear. America provides the hard power backbone, and allies provide enough political and military support to keep that backbone from looking purely unilateral. If that second part starts failing during a Gulf War, then the alliance still exists on paper, but the political trust inside it takes a hit. What makes the timing worse is that this is happening during an energy emergency. AP reported that the International Energy Agency announced the largest release of emergency oil reserves in its history, 400 million barrels. G7 countries are supplying about 70% of that total, and the United States alone is releasing 172 million barrels. That is not the behavior of a market facing a small, temporary wobble. That is the behavior of governments trying to stop an economic panic from getting out of control. So, when Allied countries refuse to commit warships while also benefiting from the emergency measures meant to cushion the shock, Washington can frame that as burden shifting. And politically, that frame is powerful. America fights. America releases oil. America absorbs the risk, and others urge restraint from a safer distance. But Europe has its own logic too, and it is not entirely irrational. European leaders can look at this war and conclude that joining a US-led naval operation now would make them co-owners of an escalation they did not authorize and do not control. They can also point out that once their ships are in the Gulf, they would be exposed to exactly the kind of retaliation they are trying to avoid. The Financial Times described this as fear of being drawn into a broader conflict with Iran. That phrase gets to the heart of it. The reluctance is not really about whether Hormuz matters. Everyone knows it matters. The reluctance is about whether joining America militarily now would trap Europe inside a campaign whose end state is still unclear. That uncertainty is everywhere in the reporting. Reuters said Trump urged friendly nations to send warships to secure Hormuz, even as Iran threatened wider escalation across the Middle East. The AP then reported that regional attacks were spreading, and that allies remained reluctant even as Washington insisted the strait had to be reopened. This is the kind of environment where Allied planners start asking the question that matters most in every military coalition. What exactly is the mission, and when does it end? If the mission is merely escorting ships after a ceasefire, some partners may eventually join. If the mission is coercive naval confrontation while the war is still active, the list gets much shorter. That distinction could decide everything. A post-conflict maritime stabilization mission is one thing. A wartime operation to force open a mined, missile-threatened strait while the U.S. and Iran are still effectively in combat is something much bigger. AP's reporting makes clear that experts do not see a quick, clean reopening during active hostilities. Insurance markets are already spooked, shipping companies are cautious, and the threat envelope is broad. So even if Trump wins rhetorical support, rhetoric alone will not move tankers. It will take naval presence, mine countermeasures, surveillance, air cover, and above all, a willingness to absorb danger over time. Right now, that willingness appears far stronger in Washington than in Allied capitals. And there is another layer here, the credibility cost of asking and being refused. Great powers do not like public rejection, especially not in the middle of a war. If Trump requests warships from allies and major states answer with variations of "not this war" or "not under these conditions," that is more than a policy disagreement. It is a visible limit on American leverage. It tells adversaries that Washington cannot automatically convert political alignment into military participation. It tells neutral states that U.S. coalition building is more fragile than advertised. And it tells domestic audiences that America may be paying the price for treating alliance management as transactional for too long. None of that means the U.S. loses its power, but it does mean its power starts looking lonelier. You can already see how the burden is concentrating. CENTCOM's public releases show the U.S. carrying the visible strike mission through epic fury. Official media show U.S. bombers, destroyers, and carrier assets in the area of responsibility. There is no comparable stream of Allied combat participation attached to the current push around Hormuz. That does not prove others are doing nothing behind the scenes, but it does show who is publicly fronting the campaign. When the images, strikes, deployments, and casualty announcements are overwhelmingly American, the message becomes hard to miss. Whatever the diplomatic coalition may be, the military burden is still overwhelmingly on the United States, And that burden is not only military, it is domestic too. AP reported that Trump postponed his China trip to focus on the war in Iran and the effort to protect Hormuz. He is also pressing China, Japan, South Korea, Britain, and France to help secure the route. That shows how one Gulf crisis can swallow broader foreign policy bandwidth. Suddenly, trade, diplomacy, energy, alliance politics, and military operations all become tied to a single choke point. If allies do not step in meaningfully, Washington does not just face more tactical risk in the Gulf. It faces strategic distraction everywhere else. The more America has to do alone in one theater, the fewer options it has to manage pressure in others. The economic shock makes that even more dangerous. AP reported that the Panama Canal's administration expects rising Gulf fuel costs could reroute more traffic toward Panama. Airlines, shipping firms, and commodity markets are all adapting to the turmoil. The point is not that the world economy stops if Hormuz closes. It is that the cost of adaptation rises fast, and every extra day of disruption multiplies political pressure. So Washington is not only dealing with a military choke point, it is dealing with a countdown clock measured in prices, inflation fears, and market nerves. If allies stay out while the U.S. carries the security burden, then America owns not just the operational risk, but much of the political blame if reopening Hormuz takes longer than promised. There's also a darker strategic possibility. Allies may believe that the more alone America feels, the more likely it is to limit its objectives. From that angle, withholding warships is not abandonment, but pressure. Europe may be calculating that if Washington cannot multilateralize the mission, it will eventually have to narrow it. They may expect Washington to seek a negotiated off-ramp or accept a more defensive posture rather than chasing decisive escalation. That would fit the German position that real security for Hormuz requires negotiation, not just more ships. Whether that calculation is right is another question. But if that is how some allies see the crisis, then their reluctance is not indecision. It is strategy, one designed to avoid being pulled into a conflict they think Washington itself may ultimately need to dial back. Still, this strategy comes with costs for them too. If the U.S. concludes that allies benefit from American protection while dodging shared risk, then future bargaining inside NATO gets rougher. Burden-sharing disputes were already a permanent feature of alliance politics. A Gulf crisis, where America asks for visible help and gets very little, could turn those disputes into something more corrosive. It raises the question of whether the alliance is still operationally meaningful outside Europe's immediate neighborhood. Trump's own language already points in that direction. Even if those remarks are partly performative, they are politically potent. They tap into an old American complaint that allies are eager for U.S. guarantees, but reluctant to join U.S. dangers. And this is where the phrase NATO break becomes useful if it is handled carefully. No, NATO has not dissolved. No, Article 5 has not been repealed. No, alliance institutions have not formally split. But yes, the war is exposing a break in expectations. Washington expected more visible solidarity in securing a waterway that underpins the global economy. Key allies expected Washington to understand that they would not join a wartime maritime campaign without a clearer political end state. That gap, between what America expected and what Europe was prepared to do, is the real break. It is a break in strategic assumptions, and those are often more important than formal communiques. So what happens next? One path is that the U.S. proceeds with a mostly unilateral maritime security effort. Another is that Washington shifts toward a narrower containment approach. A third is that some allies join later, but only under a rebranded framework that looks more defensive and less like participation in Trump's war. AP's reporting suggests the timing of any reopening effort matters enormously. The danger level during active combat is still too high for many governments to justify participation. That means the real fight may not be over whether allies ever help. It may be over when, under what label, and after what political changes they agree to do so. For now, though, the immediate signal is unmistakable. The United States asked. The allies hesitated. Trump lashed out. Europe stressed diplomacy. And the Gulf crisis kept widening. That combination is why this story is bigger than a single request for warships. It is a live test of whether America's alliance system still functions as a wartime force multiplier in the Middle East, or whether it now functions mainly as a peacetime political club, whose members become much more selective once the missiles start flying. If Washington ends up carrying the security mission in and around Hormuz, mostly alone, the military outcome will matter. But the alliance lesson may matter even more. And that brings us to the bottom line. America may not literally face Iran with zero partners, but the evidence now points to something almost as significant. In the most dangerous phase of the Gulf crisis, Washington cannot assume NATO or its closest allies will automatically convert sympathy into ships. The result is a new kind of strategic loneliness, not weakness, not isolation, but a harder reality. The U.S. still has unmatched power, yet increasingly finds itself carrying the sharpest edge of the burden alone. That is the real alliance strain this war has exposed. And if it deepens, the story will not just be about the Gulf. It will be about what American leadership looks like when the coalition arrives late, reluctantly, or not at all.